Now, I'd also like to welcome to the stage Michal Morris. And Michal is the CEO of In Touch Multicultural Centre Against Family Violence and a member of the State Government Family Violence Steering Committee. Let's make Michal welcome.
There's a lot of technology here. Hi, and thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. To begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the women who've experienced family violence, and in particular migrant and refugee women. I'd like to recognise the path that these women have forged as they stood up for their rights and crafted the services that we deliver today. It's because of these women that we're currently living through a time of great reform. I say particularly because I work at In Touch, which is a specialist family violence service that works with refugee and migrant women. And in a minute, I'll go into a bit more detail about what In Touch does and why it does it. So, firstly, the Me Too movement. What can I say? Or rather, what can't I say? Every time I started writing this speech, there'd be another headline, another event, and another development, many of which would make me think deeper and longer on the question before me. It's been a year since the movement erupted, so there's a lot to think about. To recap, just in the last couple of months in Australia, we've had the bullying accusations within the Liberal Party, which has us rethinking leadership, quotas and representation. The Australian Human Rights Commission have launched an independent inquiry into workplace sexual harassment. We have our own Now movement, spearheaded by women prominent in the media. And of course, there's been many accusations against high-profile men. Overseas, Bill Cosby's gone to jail. Louis C.K. came back to the public domain after just 10 months. Brett Kavanaugh has been appointed to the Supreme Court Justice. He's been appointed a Supreme Court Justice, amid allegations to drinking to excess, assaulting women since his teenage years and lying to the American Senate. And of course, there was the subsequent mocking of Christine Blasey Ford by the President of the United States of America, who stated that now it's a bad time for boys and men. Bollywood's having a Me Too movement. The French female actors reject Me Too as a witch hunt. And a man accused Asia Argento, one of the leaders of Me Too, of sexual assault after she accused Harvey Weinstein. And as Anne Summers wrote in the Australian Financial Review recently, what Me Too has shown us is that no woman is exempt from being preyed upon, no matter how famous or rich or white she is. While many of the headlines have been quite sensational, in essence, the Me Too movement is a movement about sexual harassment in the workplace. The movement places the responsibility on individual women to come forward and individual men to change their behaviour without addressing structural change. More often than not, a woman will go online and make accusations about more senior, more powerful men who use their status to harass and assault. The individual activity by thousands and thousands of women comes together to transform the individual act into a movement. I understand the cathartic nature of telling your story and being heard. That is a key activity of what we at In Touch do. It's how we start working with over 1,000 women a year that seek our help. But then we go on to supporting these women to move on from this experience and rebuild their lives. We use their stories and experiences to develop policy, to write submissions to government, develop training for other services and work with communities to undertake prevention activities. I believe that to move from a movement to a societal response, we need to agree on how to utilise these experiences and stories. So it's more than a cathartic feeling, but also a learning and a change. Also, to be honest, I'm not sure that migrant and refugee women have had their Me Too moment. So I'm going to argue that we need to create a more inclusive movement. Migrant and refugee women are highly marginalised. Even though 46% of the community were either born overseas or have one parent born overseas, their views and experiences are not contributing to how we respond to such cultural movements. According to the University of Sydney's Women and the Future of Work study released this year, 10% of women have been sexually harassed at work. But when we break it down to more marginalised communities, it's 18% of women with a disability and 16% of women from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. So while the movement is dynamic, it's not inclusive of some parts of our community where the impact of harassment is greatest felt. We're not hearing the voices or learning about their experiences within the great outpouring of this movement. There are many reasons for this, and I'd like to explore a bit of my earlier statement about structural reform. Inequality is not only defined in terms of gender, but also by class, by race, by ability and by sexuality. For migrant and refugee women, there are many barriers to equitable participation. There's a lack of social connectedness. There's poor knowledge about their rights, the law and the service system. There are limited work options for them. Many have a mistrust of authority, including the police and our legal systems. Some have limited English language skills, like me. Some have some cultural barriers. Some are limited by their experience of pre-migration and settlement. And for others, there's concerns about the uncertainty of their legal rights, particularly if they're on a temporary visa. Their issues not addressed in the community will stop women from multicultural communities fully participating in Me Too. So what about the Victorian family violence reforms? The good news is it is more inclusive. The reforms came out of a very systemic and structured process, the Royal Commission, as the Minister's mentioned, a government-appointed process. The Royal Commission into Family Violence came out with the 227 recommendations, which now the government are slowly and systemically implementing. The scope and the breadth is huge. It moves from administrative reforms to strengthening the service system response to developing preventative infrastructure and delivering on community messages. It does have a focus on diversity, and there are a number of recommendations on that issue, and one that identifies a specific role for In Touch. It's recommendation number 139, and it calls for the Victorian Government to fund In Touch, as well as Senior Rights Victoria and Women with Disabilities, to deliver training to the specialist family violence services and general services, and also to build partnerships to provide advice to the specialist family violence and universal service to help them respond effectively to the needs of these communities. I love that recommendation, not because it mentions my organisation, but it explicitly recognises the experiences of migrant and refugee women. It identifies that all things being equal, it takes additional knowledge and skills to support different parts of the community, but that we need to make that happen, and that this should be the norm. It's not saying that In Touch should be all things to all refugee and migrant communities, because in all honesty, we couldn't. And that women should always have the right to choose where they go for help and how they receive it. So how can we compare the two movements, in particular how each includes multicultural communities? One is focused on the individual as the centre of the reform, but has a huge following and a huge impact. The other is systemic reform on community attitudes, service systems, the judicial system, undertaken by many individuals, but within institutions. And I believe that both are important. I see both the Me Too movement and the family violence reforms here in Victoria as different kind of expressions of feminism. Separately and together, they have opened up a form of discussion that would have been avoided just a few years ago. At family dinners, over drinks with friends, within workplaces, many more discussions are being held over what is and what is not acceptable behaviour. We're also exploring the link between power and exploitation, and we're rethinking consent. This has the capacity to be huge. I say capacity because we're not there yet. If we want everything that has happened in the past 12 months to stick, we need to do more. From the individual action to a movement to the systemic response. We need to link the two discussions, one that takes place within the walls of family structures and relationships, and the other is within our workplaces. It needs to be brought together to create a discussion that can lead to action, that can lead to change. And we need to grow both movements to allow for different types of voices. Open up the conversation to be challenged by various perspectives. Too many times diversity is included when we start to look around and ask, who've we missed out on? Many of our services are founded on that deficit model. Take my organisation, for example. In Touch was established 34 years ago because the response to family violence that was developed 10 years before that didn't respond to the needs of women from multicultural communities. Within the existing service system, there was no consideration of the use of language other than English to communicate and the need to explain and do things within a different cultural context. In Touch started as a support to women from non-English speaking countries who had experienced family violence and the refuges that they went to. Since that time, we've developed, expanded, contracted. Today, through the family violence reforms, we're the biggest we ever have been. I lead a statewide agency whose vision is for culturally diverse families to live free from violence. We do this by working across the family violence continuum at every level. We actively work with communities on education and prevention. We work on early intervention. Recently, we received funding to work with men who use violence, and one of our pilot sites is here in Brimbank. We provide post-crisis support to women from refugee and migrant communities, last year 1,400 women. And when our clients face other crises, we're there to help them through it. We have a legal service and a migration agent to ensure our clients receive the best advice and assistance to their circumstances. We provide group work in recovery space to support women to move past the crisis. And dispel that myth, there is not one culture that is more violent or less violent than any other. I've not heard of one culture where there is no need for a Me Too movement or more funding into family violence. But what is unique for our clients at In Touch is that men who use violence against them will often use the tools of migration and resettlement as forms of control and manipulation of violence. So as well as trying to untangle the experience of family violence, we have to look at the visa status of the women, the visa status of their children, and sometimes the visa status of their partner. Last year, 50% of the women we supported in our client services were on some kind of temporary visa. This means that many of the women did not have the right to stay in the country. Many of the women did not have a right to work in this country. Many of the women did not have a right to work here, who did have a right to work here, did not have any access to employment services to help them get a job. Many of the women did not have any form of income. Many of the women did not have housing. Many of the women had been lied to and deceived about their visa status. They missed the timelines to even apply to stay here. And some of the women we work with had to choose between leaving their children and going back to their home country or going back to the man who had used violence against them. I'm not sure you realise this, but our migration program is changing. We're accepting less permanent migrants and more migrants on temporary visas. Today we have approximately 2 million people on a temporary visa, a working visa, a study visa and sometimes a tourist visa. And the overwhelming majority of these 2 million people will come here, will stay for a while, will leave with only good memories and experiences. It's a good thing. But if you are one of the few where your experience is different and you put your trust into someone who harmed you, your time here will be incredibly hard. I know migration law is a Commonwealth issue, but every day these laws in their current form are hurting people here in our community. And because of this, we do need to do more advocacy. At In Touch, we work very hard to ensure that not just my voice is heard, but also the voices of the women that we support. And to put that into some form of structure, we've developed a Victim Survivor Advisory Group. They're our go-to body for consultation whenever we at In Touch want something to change, but also when external agencies want to know what multicultural communities are thinking about certain ideas in family violence. It's a consultative body and I invite others to come and approach me, and if you'd like to hear other opinions and voices done with an accent, you can speak to these women as well. So, just to recap, I think we are living in really exciting times. I think we're at the precipice of a significant change, but to make more of this change, we need to open up and be more inclusive. The Me Too movement needs to start thinking about sustainability and structure, and the family violence reforms need to open up to the dynamics of popular movements, and both need to open up to include the voices of other accents and other experiences. We all need to change. I'll finish off by telling you of a significant change that happened at In Touch last week. In Touch started 34 years ago as a feminist collective, and over that time we've slowly evolved and developed to meet the challenges of the times we're living in. Today we are a company limited by guarantee with a skills-based board, and last week we employed our first male team member ever. This is an indication of how much change I and In Touch are willing to take to make sure we ride this momentum wave of change. Thank you.